Hey everyone, and welcome to this recording of my overview of the first of the 5 prisms that we use at IRLE to analyze regulatory decision-making from a law and economics perspective. And this is Prism 1, Neoclassical Economics. We use 5 prisms to think through and analyze regulatory decision-making, particularly in the face of unknown and changing conditions associated with technological change and innovation. The first is neoclassical economics, the second, innovation and dynamism, the third is institutions and economic organization, the fourth, public choice economics, and the fifth is the innovator's dilemma. And today I will be going through a high-level overview of neoclassical economics, what it is, and how we can use it to think about regulation. Neoclassical economics is a synthesis of a variety of economic theories. That synthesis really occurred after 1871. 1871 is an interesting and important date in economics for a few reasons that will interest you if you're interested in the history of economic theory. Suffice it to say that there were some different economists doing some different really important work on ideas having to do with value and what are the sources of value and where do prices come from, and that we had a pretty substantial paradigm shift in that in the early 1870s. And so it's very much a synthesis, and the person who is largely credited with this synthesis is Alfred Marshall, who's pictured here on the right, a very important British economist who was active in the late 19th and early 20th century. He was the synthesizer. He's the one who basically pulled together the analytical framework that we think of now as neoclassical economic theory. So it's neoclassical economics is very much a framework for analyzing economic decisions and outcomes, focusing on supply and demand in markets. And the things that we emphasize when we think about supply and demand are cost and choice. And very much embedded in this analysis is the fundamental insight that you get from economics, right? The number one, top of the list, fundamental insight that you get from economics, which is incentives matter. People respond to incentives, whether they are in a consumption decision-making context, a production decision-making context, investment, innovation. Incentives matter, and people respond to incentives. And so part of what we do in economics is put some analytical prediction on how people respond to incentives. And so the analysis of different markets and how we achieve particular outcomes in markets, what prices and quantities we get in markets, how markets outcomes change when you have changes in substitute goods, changes in complement goods, when you have changes in the exogenous environment. Those are the kinds of things that we do within neoclassical economics and using Marshall's framework. Neoclassical economics definitely emphasizes equilibrium outcomes more than the processes of getting to those outcomes, although those processes are very important and I would argue kind of underappreciated. Neoclassical economics has some important basic assumptions. Here I'm going to identify 3 that are going to be relevant to how we at IRLE think through the different prisms that we use to analyze regulatory decisions. First basic assumption in neoclassical economics is that individuals have subjective preferences. And this was actually the main insight in this work around 1871. Because before in the way we did economics, pre-1871, economists assumed that goods had intrinsic objective values that you could discover and identify. And that's where prices came from. But with subjective preferences, And that's a recognition that different individuals value different goods differently, and that they make different decisions based on those valuations. And so if I'm looking at a decision between ice cream and cake, and I have different preferences over ice cream and cake, then if I'm presented with a decision, I have my subjective preferences that will inform my decision of which one I prefer and how much I am willing to pay for ice cream or for cake. The neoclassical economics framework associates preferences with values, and we turn that into a willingness to pay. And that's how we construct demand curves. And on the flip side, with producers also have subjective preferences because they're still individuals. And even when they come together and operate as firms, and what is subjective is their opportunity cost, their perception of their opportunity cost, of what they have to give up in order to do the production that they are going to undertake. And so there, it's the association of that underlying opportunity cost with their willingness to accept how much they have to be paid in order to produce something. And so whether you're a consumer or a producer, as an individual, you have subjective preferences and opportunity costs. The second basic assumption is that individuals maximize utility and firms maximize profits. So think of utility as just a measure of the welfare or the benefit that you get from consumption. And so individuals maximize utility subject to the budget constraint, and firms maximize profits, which means they're trying to maximize revenue and minimize costs. And so those are mathematically what we classify as their objective functions when we try to model their decision making. Finally, the third basic assumption I want to identify here is that individuals act independently on the basis of relevant information. There's a large body of economic theory from the 20th century that is grounded in an assumption that all participants have full information. I would argue that that's a very strong assumption. Actually, I'm not the only one. A lot of economists would argue that that's a strong assumption, and have worked on developing economic models that relax that full information assumption. So I'm just going to say here, we would assume the basis of relevant information. The starting point for how we can take neoclassical economics and apply it to regulatory decision-making is the basic market model. And the basic market model takes the preferences of consumers and the willingness to pay and their individual demand that comes out of that, puts them all in a market demand curve for ice cream, and looks at the costs associated with supply and puts those suppliers together in a market on the supply side for ice cream, and we analyze the outcomes when you have demand and supply. And the equilibrium that we get is where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, and that clears the market and tells you how much ice cream is going to be sold and at what price. So we have a continuum of different market structures that we look at and we develop in economics. At one end is the competitive benchmark. And remember, this is a theoretical benchmark, that these are stylized representations of the actions and decisions of real world people who are consuming and producing. So the competitive benchmark model has lots of buyers and sellers. Ice cream is a homogeneous good in this model, which is, of course, obviously a bad assumption, but we'll go with it for now. And the demand curve reflects the willingness to pay of consumers. If there are a lot of buyers and sellers, there are a lot of small sellers all selling the good, and it's a homogeneous good. And so that means that those sellers are price takers, which is where you get this horizontal supply curve at that price, which is the marginal cost, the additional cost of producing an additional unit. And so in this market structure, the equilibrium is going to occur where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, a high quantity and a low price, and a lot of consumer welfare or consumer surplus generated from the fact that consumers that can buy at that price, they're willing to pay at least that price, but they don't have to pay the higher price they're willing to pay. They just have to pay the market price. And so they get all this consumer surplus because they're willing to pay more and they don't have to, which is awesome. The opposite end of the continuum for the market model is the monopoly model. And in the monopoly model, I'm not going to go through the detail of deriving what marginal revenue is and how marginal revenue is different from demand. But in the monopoly model, where you have a single producer, a single seller, and a lot of consumers still, same demand curve, what you have is a situation where the monopolist is not a price taker. The monopolist can choose what price to set, and they're going to choose a price that maximizes profits. And in this case, the price that maximizes profits is one where there's a lower quantity sold compared to the quantity that you would get in the competitive model, and a higher price is charged. So comparing the two, you get a higher price and a lower quantity in the monopoly model with a single seller. You still get some consumer surplus for consumers who are willing to pay at least the market price that they have to pay PM. But what's different and what's important about the monopoly model is that if you have the single seller and they choose to reduce output to charge a higher price, they're generating what we call deadweight loss, which is compared to the competitive outcome, there is less benefit or less welfare being generated, less surplus being generated, because they're selling less output and they're charging a higher price for it. Deadweight loss is a relative concept. It's always with reference to the competitive benchmark model. And so remember that these are two stylized extreme cases. The reality, of course, is muddier and falls somewhere in the middle, but we use these two extreme cases to help us identify some of the systematic frameworks that when we think about markets. The market structure and application of it that's particularly relevant to regulation is where we take this idea of market model and we apply it in a case that has what are called economies of scale. With economies of scale, you have a situation on the cost side where the cost per unit of output, the average cost, is decreasing as you produce more output, and it never turns back up. And so that average cost per unit of output, having it be decreasing over what we call this relevant range of demand, that's a situation that we call economies of scale. And with economies of scale, the most utility maximizing, profit maximizing, overall maximizing way to produce that output is to have a single firm do it, because having a single firm produce this amount of output allows you to take advantage of the cost decreases that come with economies of scale, right? If you had smaller firms, they would only be able to produce at a higher average cost. And so having one large firm produce all of the output to satisfy this market demand is going to be cost minimizing. This is the groundwork for the natural monopoly model, right? In the natural monopoly model, Q monopoly would be the monopoly outcome, lower output, higher price. But the problem here is that the competitive benchmark outcome at marginal cost equal, price equals marginal cost and high output, that if that's the market outcome that you get when you have an open, low entry barrier, lots of entry and exit market, and you have economies of scale, the problem is that all of those firms aren't going to be able to stay in the market because they can't cover their fixed costs, because the revenue that they would earn would not cover the average cost. And that is going to be a problem. And so that's the fundamentals of the natural monopoly model and the justification for a regulated price. And the regulated price is the benchmark, the theoretical benchmark for the regulated price is to try to set price equal to average cost, where that demand curve intersects the average cost of that economies of scale cost structure. So this is really the underlying theoretical guts of natural monopoly regulation. This is still a useful model. I think it has been the theoretical foundation of 20th century utility regulation, and it also continues to be the foundations of price theory and market theory, and is the theoretical foundation for how we understand markets. And that doesn't change. The way I think about this is I always think about the quote from the statistician George Box, who famously said, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." And so I think it's important for us to always ask, not just about the neoclassical model, but all of the different economic and regulatory models that we use, is how useful are they? And I think it's important to point out that the neoclassical economic models, and particularly the natural monopoly model, are static, right? They are taking a snapshot view of a stylized representation of a market interaction. And so as a static theory of regulation, it really is most relevant when technologies are stable, technologies are not changing, the process of economic value creation is stable and unchanging. If you don't have technological change, and so the technology is just, the technology base is set, and this is how we do what we're doing, then that is when the natural monopoly model is the most useful. But that's definitely not the case in the 21st century, where we have increasingly distributed and decentralized and decentralizing processes coming from technological change. You know, we have rooftop solar, we have more and more distributed energy resources, and we also have digitization that is enabling us to be connected together in a more distributed and decentralized network, both of energy technologies and communication technologies. And so we are in an environment with very vibrant technological dynamism. And so neoclassical economics is still a useful model, but it's not very useful in and of itself for helping us to understand the implications of the processes of technological change. And that's why we are going to have to use more than one prism, why we have multiple prisms, two of which speak directly to innovation and dynamism. Prism 2, it will discuss importantly some of the dynamic economic models of creative destruction coming from economists like Joseph Schumpeter. And then we will use other prisms of economic analysis and technology to help us deepen our understanding.